So what we're going to do is we're going to educate and inform ourselves today as League members as to the status of the movement to abolish the Electoral College. And we want to talk about why the Founding Fathers, what the Founding Fathers intended in establishing the Electoral College, where it has taken us, and how it damages our democracy. So this position was adopted in 1970, and it was most recently updated in 2010. So first, let's talk about what the Founding Fathers intended by the Electoral College, by establishing the Electoral College. It's taken up a lot of book chapters, but we're going to distill it down to the essential elements. So, the most important consideration that they wanted to limit the potential for corruption and concentration of power and maintain the independence between the executive and legislative branches. So they wanted a method other than having Congress select the president, which was the method originally suggested by the delegates. So why not just elect the president directly? Well, they worried that the large distances and lack of communication would make the people ill-informed about the candidates and unlikely to choose the best person. And they also worried that people could easily be misled by a few designing men or would simply vote for the candidate from their own state. So they wanted some kind of intermediary system. And also, there was an ongoing tension between the north and southern states, and slaveholding states did not want direct election because they wanted their enslaved peoples to count as 3/5 of a person in determining the number of electors the state received. So this was the arithmetic used to determine their numbers in the House of Representatives. The electoral system actually artificially boosted the voting representation of slaveholding states, just as in Congress, whereas a direct popular vote would only count the number of people who could vote, which of course did not include enslaved people. So, in fact, the evidence suggests there was a lot of discussion and confusing, changing of minds, and it was one of the last issues discussed. It was a long, hot, contentious convention, and fatigue and impatience may well have played a role in its adoption, but it had broad, unenthusiastic support and seemed like the best they could do at the time. So they called it the second choice of many, but the first choice of few. We didn't know how it would play out in history. One historian called it a jerry-rigged improvisation. Most of the framers did intend for the selection of the president to be based on the popular wishes of the citizenry, and the electoral system was an intermediary system to breach the difficulties of distance and communication. And James Madison considered it to be the next best thing to direct selection. He said the president is indirectly derived from the choice of the people. However, there is some evidence that they also expected the electors to exercise their own discretion as a bulwark against corruption and bias. But the electors have almost always acted as a rubber stamp on the votes of the people, with very few exceptions. And in those instances where an elector had voted differently than the state, they were met with a great deal of anger and protest. And the people expect the electors to be a rubber stamp on the will of the people and have never been interested in them exercising their own discretion. So none of those concerns are relevant today because we are quite able to become informed about the candidates no matter where they live. The framers' concern about corruption and concentration of power that would come if Congress selected the president is still valid, but no one is proposing that we move to this system. And any notion that we might need electors to exercise their own discretion to overturn the so-called poor decision by the people has not been borne out. The people don't want this, and the electors have rarely done it. So why does the League of Women Voters take this position? It's simple. It's a concept of one person, one vote. The unintended result of the Electoral College is to put the choice of president and vice president in the hands of voters in only a few so-called battleground states or swing states. What are these states? Ohio, Iowa, Nevada, and Florida. And they are our well-known swing states. And they're among the 19 states that received all campaign visits from the two presidential candidates in 2008. And the other 31 states received not one visit. So what? In the age of television and smartphones, we can watch the candidates on TV or on our smartphone. We can get the highlights from any number of news outlets. But the problems with this system go well beyond our ability to hear what the candidates have to say. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Electoral College is that it creates a disincentive to vote for citizens living in non-battleground states, which is the majority in our country. So if you live in Illinois or Mississippi, why should you bother going out on a cold and rainy day to vote when you know your state is only going to be blue or red, right? So the data from 2016 bear this out. See in the graph that the percentage of eligible voters who cast a vote for president was significantly lower in non-swing states compared to the swing states. So the league says this decreases participation in our democracy, and this is bad for democracy. Another negative effect is that it polarizes our electorate and exaggerates our sense of being a divided nation. We are a nation of red versus blue, and that's it. Did you know that in Alabama, 2016, 35% of the voters chose Hillary Clinton? Or that 32% of California voters chose Donald Trump? And that's a lot of people, not a fringe minority, but a significant portion of the population of these states. And these are two solidly red and blue states. What about Colorado? 43% of the voters went for Trump. Georgia, 46% went for Clinton. But it doesn't matter. When you look at this map, all you see is blue and red and right and left and black and white. There are no centrists and there's no complicated middle ground. So there's no reason for us to go out and talk to other people who don't look like us. So what if it looked like this? This is the 1984 election, Reagan versus Mondale. It was the most lopsided election according to the Electoral College, right? But remember that 37 million people voted for Mondale. That's 41% of voters, and that's not a trivial number. And it highlights the way the Electoral College simply erases the diversity of opinion in our democracy. But when you see it through the Electoral College, almost all of those so-called blue votes that voted for Mondale, they are utterly forgotten and erased. And where did all of those Mondale voters go? They're gone. They just don't exist. All we see is 525 electoral votes to 13. That's the outcome. If we began to see election results like this, the 2012 election, we might begin to see ourselves as part of a unified democracy, choosing our leader together no matter where we live. We might become open to diverse and complicated opinions among our neighbors and fellow citizens, and more willing to live among people who disagree with us. Imagine if instead of seeing ourselves as red or blue, we saw ourselves simply as Americans. And the results of two elections point us to this. Another source of the problem of the Electoral College. It can lead to a presidential winner who did not receive a majority of the voters. And this has happened 5 times in our history, and I'll update that. And it's the main reason most people find the Electoral College troubling. So you may have heard somebody say, yes, all of that's true. Why is the Electoral College? But this is why the Electoral College still makes sense. So let's walk through the common sense myths and misperceptions. Myth number 1, without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by a couple of big states like California, New York, and Texas. The fact is that direct election by popular vote would ensure that every person is equally represented regardless of where they live. Here's the example. California has the largest number of voters, around 12 million voters. And the presidential vote is split just as in all states. 32% of California voters went for Donald Trump in 2016. There you see the blue and the red. But once the state's votes were totaled, all 4.5 million of those Trump votes were erased. So where did they go? Why should only a portion of a state's votes count in choosing the president of all the people? In a national popular vote system, those votes would be added to the national total along with the votes from all other states, regardless of who got the most in each state and regardless of where that state is big or small. We wouldn't be voting by state, but by person. So a California voter would get no more say in our election than a voter from Mississippi, Rhode Island, Kansas, or any other state. And this is what the framers intended when they unanimously agreed with James Madison's statement that the president is to act for the people, not the states. Myth number 2. Smaller, less populated states need the protection of the Electoral College to ensure their interests are represented by the president. The fact is that there is no coherent small state or large state interest that needs protecting. The smallest state has substantial diversity, and it's a fallacy to suggest that when a state goes red or blue, that it represents the interests of the entire state. The concerns of a farmer are very likely to be different than those of a computer programmer, whether in a smaller or large state. So small states represent a great diversity of economic interests, and they share many of those interests with large states. For example, agriculture. Most farmers live in states with large populations like Texas or Florida or California and Illinois, and they share economic interests with farmers from the smaller states all over the country. The greatest political battles of American history have been fought between opposing ideologies or economic interests, not between large and small states. There's no coherent small state interest that needs protecting. The representatives of a small state do not vote as a bloc in Congress, and their citizens do not vote as a bloc for president. And here's the 2016 election to show this. There's the smallest 1/3 of states, those with fewer than 6 electoral votes, did not all go for the same candidate. In fact, they were exactly and evenly split. 8 went for Clinton, 8 went for Trump. Small states do not vote as a bloc, and they do not benefit by the Electoral College. So, in fact, the smaller states are routinely ignored by presidential candidates. The candidates focus their time on the so-called swing states. 19 states received all campaign visits from 2 presidential candidates in 2008, and they ignored the other 31. So there's no basis for the myth that smaller, less populated states needs protecting to ensure their interests. Fact, the Electoral College actually diminishes the rightful representation of the residents of larger states. Here we are in Virginia. Virginia's population is almost 9 times larger than Delaware's. We've got over 6 million people in Virginia, and Delaware has almost 700,000. But the electors are only 4 times as many. We don't think that's fair. Myth 3. The Electoral College protects the rights of the minority from the tyranny of the majority. So our founding fathers designed our government accordingly so that 2 out of 3 of the branches of government are designed to protect the minority rights. They are the courts. So their role, the role of the courts, is to ensure the constitutional rights of the individual. The second is the Senate. Every state, regardless of population size, gets 2 representatives, and that ensures that Wyoming gets heard just as loudly as people in New York. The fact is that the courts and the Senate do protect the rights of minority groups. And the president is supposed to represent the interests of all Americans. This means 1 person, 1 vote. So, will the Electoral College mostly benefit Democratic candidates? Well, this is an update, and you can look this up for yourself. It's a bit complicated, but modern analyses show that in 1960, Republicans actually, the Republican Richard Nixon actually won the popular vote by about 48,000 over John Kennedy. And this is 2004 election. George Bush won over John Kerry with 3 million more popular votes. But if John Kerry had received only 60,000 more electoral votes in Ohio, he would have won the election. Bush would have still had the popular vote, but John Kerry would have won the election with only 60,000 more votes. So on a personal level, what about the Republican voter in so-called blue Vermont? Or the Democratic voter in so-called red Kansas? Neither of these votes feels their vote for the president counts. And this is a disincentive for them to vote. And the League says this is bad for our democracy. So fact, the system can and has affected both parties. So this is a nonpartisan issue. So how do we abolish the Electoral College? Well, the League says that they support a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College. And it's been done before. Oh, there is an amendment out there. It's been proposed, but no action has been taken. So the 27th Amendment, which was recently, the 27th Amendment was first proposed in 1791 and ratified in 1992. It took a long time, but it took one person who got angry because he got a bad grade on a report in college to start talking to his legislator, and then what he did was he just started to turn the public opinion, right? So it took a long time, but he did it within 10 years after he wrote that paper. So I'm going to just skip through this. This is what happened. So we can amend the Constitution. It's possible. What the League says is that it would be a common sense amendment. Most Americans agree it's utterly out of date and confusing and downright silly. So it's time to start building momentum and abolish this dysfunctional system of electing the president. So what can we do? We can urge our legislators in Washington, D.C. to start looking at this again. We do that, the League does that the best. But meanwhile, as we advocate for this, what can we do on a short-term basis or on an interim basis? What we have is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And this would guarantee that the presidency will be held by the person who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, and it pledges a state's electoral votes to the candidate who wins the national popular vote, but it wouldn't take effect until it's enacted by all the states possessing a majority of the electoral votes, which is 270. So that's the National Popular Vote Compact. It is in the Constitution that the states have exclusive control over awarding their electoral votes. So states are free to assign their electors in whatever manner they see fit. That's according to the Constitution. So the Popular Vote Compact has been enacted now in 12 states, not 11. Since this was updated, they have now established that or approved that in Connecticut. So they only have 98 more votes to get to 270. And it has passed in at least one House in 11 additional states. And it's been approved unanimously by committee votes in additional states with 27 electoral votes. So if all these states pass the NPV compact, we could have the president elected by popular vote. So this is a nonpartisan issue. The bill was passed by strong majorities in the Republican-controlled Arizona House, the Republican-controlled Oklahoma Senate, the Democratic-controlled Oregon House, and the Republican-controlled New York Senate. Now, proportional representation. Okay, the League rejects this, this particular system. In such a system, it would apportion the electoral votes of a state based on the popular vote in that state. So if 40% of Minnesota voters chose candidate A, that candidate would get 4 of Minnesota's 10 electoral votes. And the problem with this system is that it actually is fairly likely that no candidate would receive the 270 electoral vote majority. So, and this would send the election to the House of Representatives. Every state would only get 1 vote, regardless of their population. So why would this system be would it make it most unlikely that a candidate would receive 270 electoral votes? Well, the reason is we've always had more than just 2 parties running for president. There are third parties, fourth parties, and in the 2016 election, votes were actually cast for 31 different candidates, plus a none of the above. So let's run through a quick example. Here's the 2016 election. You see that Arizona has 11 electoral votes, 45% of the votes chose Clinton, 50% chose Trump, and 5% chose another candidate. And if we allot the electoral votes proportionately rather than winner take all, we get 5 votes for Clinton, 5.5 for Trump, and 1/2 for the others. And then in Colorado, you have 9 electoral votes, 47% Clinton, 44% Trump, 9% for others, and then the electoral votes get apportioned accordingly. And this is what's happening as other candidates are taking just a little bit away from the total votes in each state until we finally get to the total, and neither one has received 270. So in 2016, that election would have gone to the House of Representatives. So the National Popular Vote Compact avoids all this by simply stating that whichever candidate wins the nationwide popular vote is the candidate that will receive all of that state's electoral votes, and that ensures the winner of the national popular vote is the winner of the presidency. So what can we do? Well, first, we're doing it right here by looking at the system, looking at the pros and cons, looking at what we can do, talking to our neighbors, talking to our friends, talking to our family, and so on, and people in the community. You know, remember the 27th Amendment, that took a long time. It's not going to happen overnight. So who can we get to work with this, with the League on this? We can write letters to the editor, we can talk to our legislators, and so on. So the first thing we need to do is learn where our state, and maybe our neighboring states, or maybe states where you know people, maybe states where you have friends or family, or League members that have moved to other states, and say, you know, we need to work on this National Voter Compact, National Popular Voter Compact, and can you get involved in this? So where has it been enacted? California, DC, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Vermont, Washington, and Connecticut. And it's passed at least one house in these other states, and you see that Oregon is pretty close. They could do it. So that's what we can do. We can also, meanwhile, work on the constitutional amendment too. I mean, we've already passed this national compact in our state. So how do we work on the constitutional amendment? Well, we have to contact our legislators once again, and gonna have some fun doing it too. You know, it's a lot closer for the national compact. It's 98 electoral votes away. So have we passed the constitutional amendment? Yes, we have. And I know it would take hard work. But we've amended the Constitution before. We've changed the way we elect senators. We've changed the way, we've imposed term limits on the presidency. We've included Washington DC in the election of the president. We've eliminated the poll tax. We've changed the voting age to 18. So there's no reason we can't do this if you want to get involved in it. And that's it. Linda.
So who still wants us to keep that college?
What was the question?
Who
likes
still
it?
wants us to keep the Electoral College? John. You do.
You bet.
Okay. All right.
But
So
who-
he wasn't convinced.
No, but who in the government? What reasons do they have?
Chaos. They think that this was something that the founders wanted, and this was a compromise, and that if we did away with it, we would have chaos. Some people think it's an end run around the Constitution. When you say the words end run, what does that mean? Does that mean it's legal or illegal? When you talk about a loophole in the law, is that legal or illegal?
That would be up to the Supreme Court to decide.
So, it may be up to the Supreme Court. So what? We've done it before. Any other questions?
I think people don't understand how the Electoral College works.
Yeah, I know.
That's the big one. It's kind of
Yeah.
some great mystery.
Yeah.
But
Well,
if
they
you
don't
don't
take
like-
the time to understand. You know, it's when you look at a presentation like this, it's pretty, it's pretty clear, I think. You know, it's in normal language. It's not legalese. It talks about math, basically, is what it is.
There's a false premise in the presentation, I believe.
But the League of Women Voters is endorsing this, has done
Clearly,
studies on this,
clearly.
and we believe this could happen. And the League of Women Voters have been right before.
That doesn't address the fact that there's a false premise in the
Okay,
presentation.
well.
Amy, what's the question?
Yeah.
I would address that if you want me to answer that.
Just a second, Dee.
Yeah.
Oh, are you able to send this presentation to?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
This is a PowerPoint.
Okay, great.
Okay, John, let's hear the false premise.
Lincoln said it very well when he gave the Gettysburg Address. I'm very impressed with the perspicacity of the founders who wanted a stable government. And when they left the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, a woman, the country was on pins and needles. I mean, some people thought maybe they'd come up with a monarchy. There were people that wanted that. And so she asked Mr. Franklin, "Mr. Franklin, what have you brought us?" And Franklin famously said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." What we got as our government is a democratic republic, not a democracy, not a parliament. The Electoral College system, if it hadn't been included, that constitution, that document, never would have been ratified by all the delegates then. And yes, it can be changed, and if it was as advantageous to the states that have a low population density, as Amy very intelligently brought out, this already would have been a fait accompli. It's not going to happen as a constitutional amendment because I don't believe the states with low population density see it in their interest, and I think that the critics of this as an end run are exactly correct because I don't believe the League of Women Voters thinks that, in 200 years that this would pass unless the nation destroys itself or the Constitution becomes a dead letter.
But that still doesn't account for the fact that a lot of people's votes don't count.
Sure, but we're not a pure democracy. We are a republic with 50 sovereign governments that have their own laws that they pass. So it's not a democracy in the sense that, say, the Democratic Republic or
There's no resolution to this.
yeah, the principle of democracy. Just one second. Do you bridle at the fact that it takes 12 jurors to convict somebody, or 3/4 of the states to amend it? That you don't consider that unfair? There are instances where like 60% of the senators have to vote on a cloture vote. Okay, it's not always 50-50.
John, I'm
So,
going to have to cut you off just
I
because of
think- yeah,
time.
and I
Thank you
agree.
for your points.
I think that our democracy is an experiment, and I think that abolishing the Electoral College might be an experiment, but I think maybe it's an experiment we might want to fight for.
Thank you, Amy.